So our second snippet for this week looks at the end of the war and the immediate aftermath. And here it's critical in 1944 in his reelection campaign, FDR ditches his incumbent vice president, a very left-wing figure named Henry Wallace, and replaces him with a more moderate Democrat, Harry Truman. Roosevelt, who's running for a fourth term, does this in part due to pressure from Democratic sort of party leaders who recognize that he is very ill and may not survive a fourth term. That illness is not shared with the public. So when the public goes to vote in 1944, they consider FDR to be healthy. Roosevelt tells Wallace that he will allow him to serve in the cabinet, and he'll appoint him Secretary of Commerce afterwards. Wallace eventually, as we'll see, will split with the Truman administration. And if Wallace had remained as vice president, a Wallace presidency would have taken the country in a very different direction after World War II. But it's the Roosevelt-Truman ticket that runs in 1944. Roosevelt does not campaign at all in 1944. He says he's focusing on the war. Roosevelt wins, but by a much lesser margin, around 7.5 points, and the Republicans come back and carry a number of states in the upper Midwest after having done terribly in the 32, 36, and to a slightly lesser extent 1940 presidential election. So Roosevelt comes in with a fourth term, committed to establishing a peace at the end of the war. This is the final summit meeting that he participates in. This is at Yalta in the Southern Soviet Union. I mean, you can see from the photograph that physically he's in very, very poor shape. He'll pass away a couple of months after this photograph. The policies to which he commits at Yalta largely remain implemented. First, that the United States will support the creation of a United Nations to replace the League of Nations, which had collapsed. A critical difference between the United Nations on the one hand and the League of Nations on the other is that there will be a UN Security Council consisting of 5 permanent members: the US, the British, the Soviets, the French, and the Chinese, and these countries will all have a veto on any Security Council measure. So basically, this the idea here is that the UN, unlike the League, the UN is going to be effectively run by the great powers, and if the great powers don't want the UN to do something, it just sort of won't be done. And then secondly, at Yalta, FDR agrees that basically the boundaries of Europe are going to be set by the occupying armies, and the critical, so the Soviets will dominate in the East, the British and the Americans will dominate in the West, and the critical move is a promise that there will be a friendly, free and democratic, but nonetheless friendly Polish government for the Soviet Union. There's no way in a democratic election there could be a friendly government for the Soviet Union. And so this concession is interpreted correctly, I think, as Roosevelt basically saying, look, if the Soviets want to establish a puppet state over Poland and over some of these other East European countries that had aligned with the Nazis during World War II, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, the United States is going to be okay with that kind of arrangement as long as the Soviets don't try to play around in Western Europe. So in some ways, Yalta can be seen as a sort of a triumph of realpolitik, that is a system where major powers make foreign policy decisions solely on the calculation of strategic interests and really put moral concerns aside. On the other hand, Roosevelt's defenders point out, not without reason, the amount of U.S. leverage over to deal with something like Poland is really pretty limited. It's not as if the U.S. had troops in Poland, and so there wasn't a whole lot the U.S. could have done. Here's a map of Europe at the time of the fall of Berlin. This is a very famous photograph of a Soviet soldier, Red Army soldier, raising the Soviet flag in Berlin as the Soviets move in. The Germans remain in more or less full possession of Norway, Denmark, a portion of the Netherlands, and also most of the Czech lands in Czechoslovakia, but the rest of Europe has been reconquered by the Allies. Hitler commits suicide and so is never brought to justice after the war. In East Asia, the fighting is primarily done by the Chinese on the ground, and by the Americans with some assistance from the British and particularly from the Australians in naval battles. The American strategy is called island hopping, which is that the Japanese have conquered all of this territory that goes up to the red line here. And so the U.S. approach is to attack islands, not every island the Japanese have conquered, but islands that are strategically significant to reach the Japanese homeland. And so this is Okinawa and Iwo Jima. This photograph on the right, maybe the most famous photograph from the war in the Pacific, is of American Marines raising the flag at Iwo Jima, and then islands in Southeast Asia that will lead to the U.S. reconquest of its former colony, which will be granted independence right after World War II, of the Philippines. And unlike in Eastern Europe, where the Soviets are really playing a critical assistance, the Soviets remain neutral in East Asia until the day before the war ends. So war, again, largely fought by the Americans, but the Japanese, the U.S. is simply a militarily superior force to Japan, and so the question of when this war is going to end is never entirely clear. But there really isn't much doubt that the U.S. will prevail. Now, this war ends, as we all know, with the U.S. using 2 atomic bombs, the only time that an atomic or nuclear weapon was used in warfare against the Japanese. There's a lot of debate. There's a lot of debate then. There remains a lot of debate about the morality of this. One contextual item that I think is important in World War II in Europe, this was a war of just brutal savagery with regards to the killing of civilians. Both the Americans, the British, and the Germans used these firebombing strategies where they would drop incendiary devices from planes, and the goal would be to just to burn civilian areas in large cities. And so the dropping of the atomic bombs in this respect is part of a larger pattern of indifference or even willingness on the part of the parties in World War II to kill civilians as a way of undermining the morale of their foes. And Truman authorizes the dropping of the bombs after he gets a report saying that there would just be massive American casualties associated with the U.S. invasion of Japan itself. Now, the question, and the critics of Truman, and here I think they have a decent point, is the moral and strategic rationale for the second atomic bomb at Nagasaki. The U.S. only waits 3 days before using that, and why they didn't wait for a longer time to allow the Japanese government to surrender. But at the end of the day, the Japanese surrender one day after the dropping of the second bomb. The U.S. agrees to the retention of the emperor, but otherwise Japan has to consent to a U.S.-led occupation that will transform the Japanese political system. And this East Asian approach, at least the Japanese occupation, is almost entirely under the control of the United States. In contrast, in Germany, portions of Poland, the kind of darker yellow areas, these were ex-areas of Germany that are ceded to Poland. Remember, I showed that map of the Katyn Forest massacre. This is the deal that the Soviets make with the communist Poles. But Germany and Austria are divided into 4 zones. So the Soviet zone, which is in red, the British zone, which is in green, the American zone, which is in blue, and the French zone. Both the British and the Americans say that they believe the French should have an occupation zone, even though the French did very little in World War II. The Soviets say, fine, if you want, we don't really care, but you have to carve out the French zone out of your space. We're not giving the French any part of our space. They agree. So the French get the areas here in orange. And then Berlin, the former German capital, is also divided into 4 occupation zones. Now, the assumption is that these occupation zones are going to be temporary, and that there'll be a formal peace treaty that will end World War II, and that Germany will then be reunified. This, of course, does not happen, and Germany won't be reunified until after the end of the Cold War. And what quickly happens is that in the Western zone and in the Soviet zone, separate political systems are set up, separate economic systems are set up, and it becomes clear very, very quickly that the Soviets are unlikely to pull out of their zone. They're sort of Sovietizing this zone and promoting the interests of sort of East German puppets who are willing to support a communist regime in the territory. Now, the other major aspect of, so one aspect of dealing with Germany after World War II is this boundaries question. The second is the issue of war crimes. And at Nuremberg, the world's really first significant war crimes trial occurs. The goal on on part of the Western powers is to have a public prosecution that will be fair, but that will also show the German public the extent of the crime, crimes that were committed. Many of the former Nazis, find a way to elude justice either by committing suicide or sometimes by conveniently defecting to either the Soviets or the American side. But the war crimes trials results in a number of guilty findings. Many former high-ranking Nazi officials are executed, and there is a degree of justice. There are war crimes trials in Japan. They're less aggressive, I think, than the German trials. And then also remember there were all of these puppet states that the Germans had, and in the aftermath of the German defeat, many of these states also have to have war crimes trials as well. This man here is named Vidkun Quisling. He was the puppet leader of Norway during World War II. After Germany invaded Norway, they wanted a Norwegian to sort of nominally rule the country, and he was this far right politician. He agreed to back the Germans. And his last name, the last name of Quisling, becomes a kind of symbol for people who betrayed their country on behalf of the Germans. There are similar trials in France, in Slovakia, now reunified with the Czech land, so it's Czechoslovakia, in Croatia. The parties facing prosecution in these cases are they're very high-ranking collaborationist officials. All of them are guilty, but the nature of these trials, unlike the Nuremberg trials, are problematic. They tend to be more kind of political show trials than meaningful opportunities for justice. And in most cases, the collaborationist leaders will be executed by the post-war regimes. Now, it's not just Germany whose maps are redrawn. All of Eastern Europe is redrawn. The former Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which are north here, you can't really see on the recording. These are seized by the Soviets. Remember, they were seized by the Soviets after the Nazi-Soviet pact, and Stalin says, I think I'm going to keep them. I'm not going to allow them to be independent. They won't regain their independence until the late 1980s. The eastern third of Poland is seized. Bessarabia, the northeasternmost province of Romania, is seized by the Soviets. This is modern day Moldova, and Ruthenia, the easternmost portion of Czechoslovakia. And the Czechs had certainly never invaded the Soviet Union. They were a close ally of the Soviets. That is seized as well. So the goal for the Soviets is basically, look, they say, we've been invaded twice in the last 30 years by Germany, coming across Eastern Europe and attacking us. We want a larger buffer between, Moscow, Leningrad, St. Petersburg, now St. Petersburg, Stalingrad, the Russian heartland of our state. We want a larger buffer between that and a potential third German invasion. And if that means seizing huge swaths of land from our neighbors, well, we're powerful. We're going to seize the land. And the Soviets do so, and they redraw the boundaries, without much of an opposition. So unlike World War I, where at least in theory, these boundaries of Eastern Europe were drawn on ethnic grounds of self-determination, reflecting this Wilsonian vision. After World War II, this is just power politics, the Soviets coming in and taking territory for their own purposes. And one of the results of this is a massive resettlement of civilians in Eastern Europe. Now, this, of course, is occurring on top of the Holocaust. We have 6 million Jews, the majority of them coming from East Central Europe and from the Soviet Union, who were murdered by the Nazis and by collaborators of the Nazis in Eastern and East Central Europe. But beyond the murder of Jews, there also are these forced resettlements of ethnic groups throughout Eastern Europe. So Germans are kicked out of Romania, of Hungary, of Czechoslovakia. Poles are kicked out of Ukraine. Balts often flee the Soviets, and then these ones that are moving to the east, 300,000 Balts, 1.8 million Ukrainians, and other ethnic groups. These are people who are all being sent to Siberia, forcibly resettled by the Soviet Union, by Stalin, to make these areas more Russian and therefore more loyal to the state. So the result is that, unlike after World War I, where these countries in East Central Europe tended to be ethnically heterogeneous, you had lots of different ethnic groups despite a claim to self-determination. After World War II, there's a much greater degree of ethnic homogeneity. The Jews in the region are basically 99% are either killed or flee to either Israel or the United States, and the German minority, are kicked out. The Polish minority and the Russians are kicked out, and so this sort of tension of nationalism, which has been a hallmark of East European international relations in the first half of the 20th century, will become less significant as we move into the Cold War. So that's it for our second snippet for this week.